Welcome to the Deep Dive. You have handed us a truly extraordinary stack of source material today.
hmm
We're not talking about your standard case files here. We have legal appeals, handwritten self-defense letters, and, some incredibly dense philosophical commentary.
And it's drawing on thinkers from all over. You've got Western figures like Marx and Foucault right next to analysis based on Maoist theory. It's a powerful and unique collection.
It really is. So our mission for this deep dive is to synthesize all of this, to understand a single, highly publicized and controversial legal case involving a Chinese scholar, Chen Jingwan.
Right, and this isn't just about the facts of the verdict. It's about the bigger picture, the systemic critiques about law, power, and the very boundaries of intellectual freedom that this case has kicked up across the academic world.
Okay, so let's start with the subject. Chen Jingwan. He's a fascinating figure in his own right.
Absolutely. He has a PhD in physics, specializing in nonlinear complex systems. He was a researcher, and at the time of his arrest in Kunming in 2022, he was calling himself an independent scholar.
And his crime. What was he actually accused of doing?
It's almost shockingly simple. He was detained for using VPN software, the sources often call it flipping software, to get onto foreign social media platforms and then just forward things. Articles, political cartoons, commentary.
And for that, the charge was picking quarrels and provoking trouble, or Zunxin Zishi Zui. For those who aren't familiar, this is one of those notoriously vague catch-all offenses. Legal experts often call it a pocket crime or kudai zui.
Right, because you can pretty much fit anything into that pocket.
Exactly. And he was ultimately sentenced to 1 year and 8 months in prison for it.
A devastating outcome, really. And it's one that the defense fought tooth and nail. So I think the first step to really get what's going on is to look at how the prosecution even tried to make his actions fit that pocket crime definition.
Okay, let's unpack that. This central legal conflict. What exactly did the prosecution claim he did to meet the criteria for picking quarrels under their criminal law?
So the prosecution's case really stood on three specific legs. They claimed that Chen Jingwan, 1, knowingly scattered, 2, false information, that 3, caused serious chaos to public order online.
So every single one of those elements had to be proven.
Every single one. And the sources show that's exactly where the defense focused their attack on those three pillars.
So what were the main counter-arguments then, from the appeal documents and his letters?
Well, they started with the most basic thing, the content itself, this so-called false information.
Right.
Chen argued pretty vehemently that the stuff he forwarded wasn't factual in the first place. I mean, we're talking about things like political cartoons or subjective emotional posts or academic viewpoints from other scholars, like the famous jurist Zhang Run.
I see. So it's the classic difference between sharing a fabricated news report that says, I don't know, a factory has closed,
Okay.
which is a provable fact, versus sharing a satirical drawing.
Precisely. His defense made this point very explicitly. They said artistic expression and political opinions just don't have a scientific true or false standard. They even cited the famous Tang Dynasty poet Li Bai and his line about having white hair, 3,000 zhang, miles and miles of hair.
That's a brilliant legal pivot. So the defense is basically saying, look, if you can't prosecute a poet for exaggeration, how can you prosecute a political cartoon or an opinion piece for being false?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You just can't apply a scientific truth test to subjective expression.
But the prosecution was trying to do just that, flatten everything into a simple true-false box.
Which the defense said was just, legally and logically impossible, especially in a political context.
Okay, so what about that second pillar? The serious chaos part. That's usually where you need some kind of quantitative proof, right?
Yeah, and this is where the prosecution's case looked really, really weak, according to the sources. The evidence showed Chen's personal account was tiny.
How tiny?
It had fewer than 100 followers, and most of those were described as zombie fans, or just bots. His total lifetime forwards, also less than 100.
Wow. So there's no mass spreading, no public panic, no measurable disruption at all. If you need serious chaos, this seems like the opposite of that.
The sources are extremely critical here. They point out that the law usually requires actual thresholds, like a post being viewed thousands of times, or leading to some kind of major physical disruption to count as serious chaos. Chen's activity didn't come close.
Okay. And the third defense argument was about selective enforcement.
Yes. A huge point. Chen argued he was the only one being prosecuted for sharing these specific posts.
Meanwhile, the original authors and probably thousands of other people who shared them.
Exactly. They were untouched, some with much bigger followings. His lawyers argued that prosecuting only him completely violates the principle of equal application of the law.
So the defense's conclusion, which it sounds like the critics all echo, is that the prosecution's case was just.
Suspended in air, that's the phrase they use. It lacked any factual grounding on all three counts.
That sets the stage perfectly for what comes next.
Yeah.
Because this is where it gets, really interesting. If the defense completely dismantled the factual basis of the charge, how on earth did the court find him guilty?
Well,
The legal critiques you sent over highlight this extraordinary and frankly pretty alarming line of reasoning.
This is the legal innovation that just stunned critics. The court basically admitted it couldn't prove that crucial element of knowingly, in Chinese, Mingzi scattering false information.
They couldn't prove his intent?
Couldn't prove it. Couldn't show he intended to cause chaos or that he genuinely believed these subjective opinions were hard facts. So they invented a justification based purely on his identity.
And that justification was what?
The court found him guilty because, and this is a direct quote from the judgment, due to his very high education and knowledge level, meaning his PhD, he should distinguish right from wrong.
Wait a second. Hold on. Are you telling me the court used his PhD in physics as the proof of his criminal intent?
That is precisely what happened.
So his intellect became evidence against him.
That's it. The court legally presumed the missing element of knowingly the intent they needed, simply because he was highly educated. The logic was that someone of his standing must have known that forwarding this content was an attack on the political system.
That's a staggering reversal of legal logic. It's an identity-based presumption of guilt. The state doesn't have to prove your intent. Your education level creates the presumption of guilt for you.
Right. If you're smart, you must be a knowing subversive.
The sources call it anti-intellectual judicial practice.
A very dangerous legal creation, they argue. It just shortcuts the entire need for factual evidence of intent and relies on status instead.
And this shocking reasoning was built on top of some pretty significant procedural failures too, right?
Oh, absolutely. The procedural failures are key. First off, the initial trial wasn't public. Then, when the case went up for appeal to the second instance court, the court just didn't hold an appeal hearing.
They skipped the hearing entirely. What was the reason they gave?
They claimed Chen did not submit new evidence.
But he was in prison.
Exactly. The critics argue this is a fundamental, probably illegal, shift in the burden of proof. How can the system demand an imprisoned defendant go out and gather new evidence when the burden is supposed to be on the prosecution to prove the original verdict was correct?
It sounds like this system was just stacking the deck against him at every single turn.
It raises very, very severe questions about due process. And if you want a single quote that just encapsulates this whole alleged disregard for facts, the sources cite the prosecutor in this case.
What did they say?
He allegedly stated, "I have not verified these posts, and I do not intend to verify them. I think they are rumors, so they are rumors."
Wow. I have to just pause on that. I think they are rumors, so they are rumors.
Mm-hmm.
That's the complete opposite of seeking truth from facts, which is supposed to be a foundational principle. It suggests the whole thing was about rubber stamping a political decision, not finding judicial truth.
And the sources argue that this quote is the key to the whole legal error chain. The indictment, the first judgment with its PhD equals intent logic, and the appeal that denied a hearing, they all allegedly just work together to legitimize a predetermined outcome.
This moves us perfectly into the last part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
Because what's so striking is that this case wasn't just analyzed through a legal lens. The sources you provided offer these massive structural critiques from, major philosophical and political schools of thought.
Right.
So let's look at the big picture. How did thinkers drawing on Foucault or Gramsci interpret this verdict?
Okay, so we can basically synthesize the philosophical critiques into three big interconnected themes. And it's all about the relationship between power and truth. The first one ties directly to Foucault's concept of the truth regime.
Right, the idea that power isn't just about saying no, it's generative. It actively produces the framework for what we even consider to be true or false.
Exactly that. Foucault argues power doesn't just forbid speech. It defines reality itself. In this case, the judicial system just unilaterally declared that political opinions, art, and academic questions, which are all inherently subjective, were yaoyan, false information.
So by doing that, the state was asserting its exclusive right to define what is real and true.
Yes. especially in the information space. And the tool they used was that ambiguous pocket crime, which suddenly became very, very specific when it was applied to an intellectual.
Uh,
The ambiguity of the Kudaizu allowed the system to essentially produce a brand new category of offense: high-educated subversive information transmission.
it's a message.
It's a huge message. Prosecuting a physicist for sharing cartoons sends a powerful, clear boundary marker to the entire intellectual class. It says, we see you, and we are holding you to a higher and maybe impossible standard.
Okay, now let's connect this to Western Marxism. Gramsci, for instance.
Mm.
How do the sources read the case through that lens of political control?
So this perspective draws a really strong line between hegemony and coercion.
Right. Hegemony is ruling by consent, getting people to agree with your rules. Coercion is just force.
Exactly. Hegemony is governance through persuasion. But since Chen Jingwan, as an intellectual, clearly rejected the official narrative, the system couldn't use persuasion, so it immediately switched to coercion.
The velvet glove comes off and the iron fist comes out.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The judiciary here, drawing on Althusser, acts as a repressive state apparatus, the arm of the state that operates by force, like arrests and prisons. And this apparatus coordinates with the law's ideological function to create a legal text that legitimizes the crackdown.
So the judicial process itself becomes an ideological performance first, and a justice mechanism a distant second.
That's the argument. And that makes the punishment less about the individual and much more about sending a signal to the whole group that rejected the hegemony.
And that leads right to the third theme, doesn't it? Manufacturing of self-censorship.
Pure Foucauldian discipline, the chilling effect.
Right.
The punishment here is framed as a perfect ritual of discipline aimed squarely at the knowledge class. By using that bizarre, unpredictable, high-educated equals guilty logic, the system forces scholars to internalize a virtual judge.
So they have to constantly guess where the invisible lines are.
Yes, and they always overestimate the danger. If the boundaries are vague, you pull your speech back further and further and further just to be safe until you're completely silent.
It forces the scholar to become their own jailer.
The sources argue it's power's most effective and, most economical form of control. You get comprehensive self-censorship without needing mass arrests. One high-profile case is enough to discipline 1,000 minds.
It's also interesting that the sources weren't just critical from a Western perspective. We also saw critiques that were rooted in official party theory itself.
Absolutely. Even when you analyze it against official mandates, like promoting comprehensive rule of law or people-centered governance, or even the goal of promoting civilizational exchange, the sources found the verdict came up short.
How so?
Well, by criminalizing the forwarding of foreign academic articles, cartoons, even speeches by foreign leaders, the verdict was seen as directly contradicting that goal of intellectual exchange. It was seen as a profound deviation from stated ideals, even when you look at it through the system's own lens.
So if we take a step back and look at the whole picture, the weak legal case, the shocking identity-based guilt, and these sweeping philosophical critiques, what's the central tension that the sources leave us with?
I think the sources all converge on this one idea, that this case is less about a failure of justice in a single instance, and far more about a systemic demonstration of power. Power asserting its absolute control over how thought is generated and transmitted.
Especially intellectual thought.
Especially. The scholar's fate becomes a kind of mirror, reflecting these broader challenges to intellectual freedom and due process when the law is, as the sources allege, subordinated to political goals.
It's a lot of dense material, but you now have the full spectrum of analysis. You're informed not just on the case facts, but on the massive structural implications it raises about truth, power, and freedom.
And the ultimate takeaway is, well, it's complex and maybe a little ironic. The sources argue that by prosecuting this kind of dissent as a low-level quarrel, the system didn't just silence one scholar, it accidentally elevated the political significance of his simple act of forwarding a link.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you to consider. Does a system that relies on vague pocket crimes and identity-based presumptions to silence opinion ultimately succeed in stifling thought? Or does it merely confirm the critical perspectives of the very theorists, like Marx and Foucault, that it seeks to suppress, making their analysis tragically relevant all over again?